into production and have people look at it. It's very tangible. It becomes very real at that point. And so that's what I want to do here. I want to talk about how we can build our applications and get them into production. So what I've done here is I've created a simple Spring Blog application in Spring Boot. It has a variety of features, which we'll go through today. And what we can do now is use that application and deploy it to production. We're going to deploy it to a variety of platforms. So I've listed a bunch of these platforms in the repo. If there are other platforms that you would like to see, go ahead and let me know. But today we're going to focus on Azure Spring Apps. And as I've gotten the chance to know this service over the last couple of weeks, I've really enjoyed it. I think that for today's example, just a simple blog service, it works well. It really shines when we get into, larger scale applications. There is an enterprise version of this. And when you get into things like distributed architectures and having things like a gateway and a configuration service and a registration service, and some of those built right into the platform, it becomes very powerful. So my hope for you is that if you haven't done this on Azure before, this will be a nice introduction. This will introduce you around to the things that you need to know to get your Spring application into production using Azure Spring Apps. So I'm really excited for this one. I hope you enjoyed too. And with that, let's get into it. All right, so if you head over to danvega/spring-blog on my GitHub repository, this is the repo that I'm going to use to take our Spring apps into production. So it might look a little different by the time you get here after we get this pushed out to a bunch of different services. There might be branches for each of them. But right now, the only one we're focused on is Azure Spring Apps. So if you take a look at this README, there's a description, what the application is, how to run it, how to test it, how you can build apps for production in Spring, kind of where this started with Spring Office Hours. And then there's a little bit more info on Spring, Azure Spring Apps, as well as the GitHub action that we're going to talk about later. And then there's some coming soon platforms. Again, we want to use this application and get this out to production on a bunch of different platforms. So that's the application. Go ahead and pull that application down if you want. And I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of the app before we go ahead and deploy it. We have a post controller. So the idea is this is a blog modeled around posts and authors and comments. I've done a similar video on this in the past. I'm using Spring Data JDBC. We have Spring Data JDBC. We're using the actuator. You'll want to put that on your project as we push it to Azure Spring Apps to kind of get some of those metrics out of the box. We're going to use Postgres. So what we're doing is we're using Postgres, and we're going to set up a Postgres database on Azure. For local development or testing, I'm using for local development, I don't have anything set up yet. So you may want to set up a local Postgres. But for any tests, I am using test containers. And that will give us the ability to run some tests quickly against a Postgres database. So we can get as close to production on our lab. There are comments, posts. I'm not going to go through each of those. Those are set up. We have a repository for author and post. And I use like a command line runner to insert data. But I think because what I'm doing locally is actually connecting to that database, because I'm considering that a dev database, I'm connecting up to my Azure database, and then I have my DB username and my DB password stored as environment variables. So you'll have to set one of those up on your own. But again, I should probably move this to like a local Postgres instance using something like Docker. And yeah, so we'll probably do that in the future. But for right now, that's what's happening. So we have this, we're setting up this JDBC URL, this test containers one. So this magic URL will basically spin up an instance of Postgres 14 Alpine. The serialization on one of the controller tests right now. But again, not super important to get or run. So we do load that schema on the Postgres instance that runs locally for tests. So that schema is super interesting about this application. But what I did want to do is kind of include a bunch of things like we're using something outside of H2. We're using some, production ready database like Postgres. We have some tests in there, which will add in some secure application looks like. We're going to head over to the Azure portal and see if we can't get this. And if you don't already have an account, you'll need to sign up. Platforms is a cost management section that you can go into. You can set up bill offers, set up some alerts so you don't spend more than you're planning on spending. Again, this is not specific to Microsoft Azure. So with that disclaimer out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So I have an account here. There's a whole bunch of services in here with, again, across cloud providers, you'll find this. There are just so many different services, right? What I like to do is go in and as I'm using these, mark these as favorites so they show up underneath my favorites. So if I go underneath my favorites, I have just the things that I'm kind of working with. If you go to your home screen, you'll have the things that you've worked with recently. So the first thing that we'll need to do is create what's called a resource group. So I have a resource group in here already. If you want to create a new one, you can go ahead and create one here. And if you go, if you want to learn more about a whole bunch in this resource, any analytics, things like that. Within that resource group, you'll have a bunch of different things, right? So I have a database in here. I have a Spring app, and then you can have other things. So underneath my favorites, I also have something called Azure Spring Apps. So this is where we're defining our Spring application. So you can call this whatever you want. I called mine Spring Blog, but what you want to do is go in and create a new one, and you'll put it underneath your subscription, and then you'll pick your resource group that we just created in the last step. From there, you can give it a service name. You can give it a region. So I'm in East. I picked East. You can define whether you want it to be zone redundant or not. And then here's where you'll go into the pricing and kind of decide on what your pricing is going to be. I think for just testing it out, really just start with the basics and you can always go from there. So you can go through all of the different settings for diagnostic, application insights, networking tags, review and create. But at that point, I would just go ahead and review and create one. So once you have a Azure Spring app, you'll be taken into this screen, which has a whole bunch of options that you can get into. Again, I'm not going to cover everything in this video. I just want to give you what you need to get up and running with your first app. The first applications are going to go. In this case, our Spring Blog is just a monolithic application. There's just one service that needs to be running. You can imagine in a distributed architecture, say you were building out an e-commerce site, you could have different services. Like I have a product service, an order service, a customer service, a gateway service, a registration service, a configuration service, all these different services that go ahead to make up your application. Again, in this case, I just have one single app, but what you want to do is you want to come in here and create a new app, give it a name. You'll choose a deployment type. So what are we deploying to? A custom container, or in our case, we're just going to use an artifact for Java. And then you'll pick your platform. So I'm using Java 17, so I pick that. And then you can go ahead and set up your CPU, your memory, and your instance count. I'm leaving those all as the defaults at first. So once you have that created, you can go into that particular application. And again, you'll be met with some more kind of configurations that you can set up. So you can go into deployments and check that out. I'm going to use the default deployment, but there's some really good information in here on, hey, if you want to do blue-green as a deployment strategy, here's what you can do. I'm just using, again, this default deployment strategy, which is fine for this case. In here, this is where you can kind of check out your app instance. You can scale the app up or out. You can check out service bindings, connectors. You can set up a custom domain name for this. You can work on ingress to app, TLS, use certificates, identities, things like that. So this is specific to this app. And then obviously in a microservices, distributed architecture world, you'd have to configure some things for different apps. Now, there are ways to kind of automate this using Terraform, but we're not going to get into that today as well. So once you have your application, and set up here. So we have our Spring Blog Azure Apps application ready to go. you need to create an artifact, which in our case is going to be a jar, and you need to deploy it. So let's talk about the first step first, which is creating an artifact. So I'm going to come into my application here. Let's just get rid of this target directory as if we didn't do anything yet. And we're going to go into the terminal. And from the terminal, again, back in the GitHub repository, I talked about two different ways that we can create something that we can use to deploy to a cloud platform somewhere. One of those is by creating a Uber jar, if we will, which contains everything. It contains all of our code, all the Spring code that we need, the embedded version of Tomcat. And the way that we do that is by using our Maven plugin. All right, so we're going to go ahead and use the Maven wrapper, and we're going to say, go ahead and package this up. We're going to clean it first, then we're going to package it. I'm also going to say, please go ahead and skip our test, and let's go ahead and run that command. And you could see that the build was successful. We ended up with a jar file. So we have this jar file, target spring-blog, the version number, and then snapshot.jar. So we can see that right here. This is the artifact that we want to deploy to Azure. Now, how do we get it up there is the next question, right? I don't see a handy upload that artifact. So how do you get it up there? Well, I'm going to go ahead and include this link to this particular article, and this walks through how to deploy your first application on Azure Spring Apps. So what you could do is go in and provision an instance here, but we've already done that, so we don't need to do that. What you can do is go ahead and create resource groups. Oh, you can do a whole bunch of things from the command line using the Azure CLI. You can also go ahead and deploy that local version of that jar file you just created to your Azure Spring Apps. Now, the way that you do that is by using this command. So you're saying AZ Spring App Deploy. You got to give it the name of the resource group, so we know what that is because we talked about creating a resource group. Then you need to give it a service. So let's go back here. Let's go to our overview here. And if you look in the service instance name, we have this spring-blog. So that's what you'll use there. The name that you want to call it, that could be the same. And then the artifact path. So in this case, you'll go into that target folder and then get that jar file that you created. Once you have done that, everything should be up there and ready to go. Now, I'm not going to go through this step because this is a very manual step. Every time you make a change, you're going to have to do this. And this can be a little bit tedious, right? Like, I don't want to do that every single time. So what you can do, if you're using something like GitHub, I've included a workflow for GitHub Actions in the repository. And so what this will do is you'll want to put in your Azure subscription here. So that subscription is just back in here. There's a subscription ID. You'll want to copy that and put this into your own workflow. So I'm using Java 17. That's my subscription ID. What it's going to do is it's going to check out your project. It's going to use Java 17. It's going to use Maven to build and clean this. So it's going to run Maven clean package skip test, just like we did from the command line. Then what it's going to do is going to log into Azure via the CLI. So this is something you could do from the command line on your own machine, or you can do here. Now, the way this works is you need to set up a secrets.azure credentials. So if we go back to my Spring blog here, if you go into settings and you go into secrets and you go into actions, you'll see that there is an environment secret for Azure credentials. You can get from the command line, and I'll leave a link to an article that shows you how to do that. So once you have the Azure credentials, now this will work. It will log into that for you. And then what it's going to do is deploy that artifact to production. So it's going to say, hey, go ahead and use that subscription, deploy it. Here's the service name. Here's the app name. Use staging deployment and false. We're just kind of we're not using that red, blue, green deployment. We're just using the default one. And then, hey, here's the package name, right? So if you were to make a change, and you would see it actually get run. So you can go in here and click on, so it sets up the job was building. You would see it. You would see if you go into actions, if you were to make a change and then commit, you would see a rebuild. So if you go into the workflow, you would see it actually get run. So you can go in here and click on this, and as it was building, you could see each of these kind of steps being run. So it sets up the job. It checks it out. Hey, we have JDK 17. We run a Maven build clean, so you can see all the output from that. It logs into the Azure CLI, deploys to production, and then cleans some stuff up. So this is a really great way to, if you're using GitHub, to go ahead and automatically deploy that artifact. If not, you'll have to do it by to go ahead and automatically deploy that artifact. If not, you'll have to do it by manually each time. Again, if you're just demoing this and testing this out, not a huge deal, but if you're going to be making changes, I would advise you to go ahead and set something up. So that is kind of the big Spring blog. Once that gets deployed, well, and then we have a testing endpoint. Again, so this is our URL, and then we have a testing endpoint. Again, you could come in and set up your own custom domain if you're going to take this live. But now what I can do is go in here, and this is the home route, which I don't have anything on. But you can go in here and say, oh, let me look at the actuator. And then I know I added some stuff to the info endpoint. So if I go in there, I can see the info endpoint there. If I go into /API/posts, I can see my single post that is there in my database. So database, that kind of wraps up the Azure Spring Apps portion. Now, hey, what if I need a database to go ahead and connect to? How do I get that? So I set up an Azure database for Postgres, and then I have just a single database in here. It's pretty, there's not a lot of resources to it because, again, I'm using it just for kind of dev purposes. But you can go ahead and check that out. And then you have a server, I'm just using a server login. So I have a DB username and password. And that's really all there is to it. It gives you, if we go back to the resources here and look at application.yaml, we just connect to that JDBC URL. So that is the name of my server, the Postgres port, the name of the data source. So I set up an actual database in here. So if you go into databases, you can see the Spring blog, and then I ran like a SQL script, that schema that's in this repository against that. And now I have that schema in there. So we have a username, password, and Spring blog. And again, I'm not using that for tests. I'm using something like test containers there. So I think those are really the only things that you need to get started. Understanding like the resource groups, how to set up an Azure Spring app. Again, we have just a single app in here. There's a lot more to this when we want to get into some like distributed stuff, right? Like we have a config server, we can set up networking, we can do storage, TSL, SSL. We can set up properties in here if we wanted to set up, I believe, maybe not there, but in the app itself, you could set up some like environment variables if you needed to. Then you can do things like monitoring, logging, alerts, a whole bunch of stuff there. So, once you have your Spring apps, then you may need a database. Again, there's a whole bunch of other things if you wanted to get into like load balancing. Outside of this particular video, but I think what I wanted to kind of get across with this was hopefully give you the few things you needed to know to be able to get that first Spring application into production on Azure Spring Apps. I'm really enjoying Azure Spring Apps. Just makes things very easy to do once you have these